You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you in further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host today, seeking to bring you the very best in the project's information, and we have got a great show with a great guest lined up for you here. Now, my guest has been teaching New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary for more than a quarter century with a BA from Biola, a THM magna cum laude from Dallas Seminary, and a PhD summa cum laude, also from Dallas Seminary, where he focused on the Greek New Testament throughout his education. He's also done postdoctoral study at Cambridge University, the Institute for New Testament Text at Textual Research in Germany. He studied at Tübingen, Glasgow, Bavarian State Library, Munich, so many other places. His exegetical syntax is the standard biblical Greek grammar from the English-speaking world, and it's been translated in half a dozen languages. He was a senior New Testament editor of the Net Bible and has been a consultant on 4 Bible translations. He's co-authored or contributed to dozens of books, member of the Society of New Testament Studies, Institute for Biblical Research, Society of Biblical Literature, and the Evangelical Theological Society, where he serves as the vice president, and he's the founder of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. My guest today is none other than Dr. Daniel Wallace. Dr. Wallace, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Thanks, Nick. Wow, what an introduction.
Well, I tried to do the best that I can. Now, that's your academic introduction, of course, but some of my listeners might not be familiar with it. So tell us a little bit about who Dan Wallace is. How did you get to be doing what you're doing now?
Well, what I'm doing now is working especially in the Greek New Testament, both in grammar and in textual criticism and exegesis or interpretation. And I made a radical commitment to Christ when I was 16 years old, and I haven't been able to shake that. It's been so deeply impressed in my mind and heart about his reality, his resurrection, that I, at that time, decided to dedicate my life to serving the Lord. And very early on, when I had made that decision, I grew up in Southern California, in Newport Beach, and I met a fellow who would sell me today's English version or Good News for Modern Man, just paperback New Testaments. I'd buy them by the box load and get them for about 25 cents a piece. And I'd drive up and down Coast Highway, picking up hitchhikers, sharing the gospel, and giving these New Testaments away. And every few weeks I'd go back to see this fellow and get some more New Testaments from him. But he was an Arian. He did not believe in the deity of Christ, and he kept trying to show me place after place that proved that Jesus was not, in fact, divine. And it got me to thinking, it got me to questioning my faith, and so I decided I've got to study Greek to see what the New Testament really says. I was reading through my New Testament every week for several months while I was in high school, and I felt, I'm crippled here. I need to know what the Greek says. So when I went to Biola, I got 4 years of Greek there, and then majored in it at Dallas in my master's and doctoral program, and here I am still doing it. But those have been some really foundational issues. What does the text say? And how do we know the text is the real text? So it has to do with textual criticism and grammar, leading to our understanding of theology and who Christ is and what our devotion to the Lord should look like. So that's really my life story.
Let's bring out one other aspect of your life story as well, since you talk about learning Greek. And I was surprised when I read this in the case of a real Jesus, is that you learned to read Greek from your own books on how to read Greek, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. So you want to hear about that story?
Yes, that one needs some explained to our
It
audience.
does, I know. I had never put it together till Lee Strobel interviewed me for his book, The Case for the Real Jesus. But back in 1997, I got a strange strain of encephalitis that almost killed me. I ended up going to 5 different hospitals and was having hallucinations and all sorts of mental attacks. I didn't know my wife's name at one point. I didn't know my own name a couple of times. I lost my languages, not entirely, but a good 80-90% at least, and had to rebuild from there. And so when I published my Greek grammar in 1996, and the fall of 97, I'm teaching again after I'd gotten this terrible attack. I was in a wheelchair for a year, and trying to teach out of my grammar, and there were times where I said, gee, I don't understand this. Other times I'd say, who wrote this stuff? Oh, yeah, I did. And then I'd say, hey, this looks pretty good. Oh, wait, I wrote that. So, I had mixed emotions going through it, but I'm using that book to reteach myself what I had spent several years, actually at that point, 26 years studying. So Strobel pointed that out. Here's a man who wrote a book on Greek grammar, and he used it to reteach himself Greek grammar because he forgot it all.
That's certainly an amusing story. I was very confused and I read that was taught, but afterwards it made sense. Yeah. So now, to get to the meat of today's issue, let's start with some basic questions about the New Testament. Is it true that we have no autographs, that is, original works of the New Testament?
It is true that we do not have those autographic manuscripts. Yeah, the originals, I'm sure, turned to dust in the early decades or centuries of the church.
And all we have then are copies of copies, right?
Yeah, we have copies of the New Testament in abundance, but we don't have the originals.
And in fact, our first complete New Testament, I think, dates from the 4th century, right?
That's correct. Codex Sinaiticus, which is probably in the middle of the 4th century, is our oldest complete New Testament.
Well, geez, Dr. Wallace, that kind of would leave us in a hopeless place, doesn't it? Because we don't have any originals. We only got copies of copies of copies, and all we've got, the first complete text is from the 4th century. I mean, doesn't that give us a hopeless position on reconstructing the New Testament? Well,
if that's all you're going to tell of the story, it might sound that way, yes, but there's a great deal more to it than that. Although the Codex Sinaiticus is the oldest complete New Testament, the next oldest complete New Testament we're waiting 500 years for. And so is it that scholars are basing their reconstruction of the original wording on those 2 manuscripts? Hardly. There are hundreds of manuscripts that we examine. And in fact, we have quite a few manuscripts before the 4th century. By the end of the 3rd century, we have between 48 and 61 New Testament manuscripts that cover the entirety of the New Testament. And we have as many as a dozen from the 2nd century. That is between 100 and 200. By the time we get to about 225, about 125 years after the completion of the New Testament, 43% of all of our New Testament verses are found in these manuscripts. That's an astounding number. But it's not just those manuscripts. We also have ancient versions, which are early translations of the New Testament. And the great thing about these versions is, for the most part, they never go back and correct by the Greek, which means that let's say you have evidence from church fathers and other things that the translation of the Bible into Latin was originally done in, say, the late 2nd century, which is about the time most scholars would say it started. We don't have any late 2nd century manuscripts of the Latin New Testament. So we have later manuscripts, but comparing all those to each other, when they agree with each other, we say that goes back to the late 2nd century. So we might have our earliest one being 4th century and then some from the 5th and things like that. But the fact is that altogether, we have this evidence that is overwhelming from Greek manuscripts, from versions, and from what's known as church fathers, the writing of the church fathers people who commented on Scripture. We have church fathers going all the way back to the late 1st century, and we start to see them doing extensive commentary on Scripture by the middle of the 2nd century. So it's kind of a triangulation. You put all this evidence together, and it is very, very powerful for telling us what the original wording is.
And now this field that you do this in, it's called textual criticism. Some people might be listening and thinking, well, that doesn't sound like something good. Why should we criticize the text of the Bible?
Well, criticism basically simply means research, and it's almost a German transliteration into English from kritische. So you've got criticism in German has to do with either criticism of something objectively or research. But here's what it means. It doesn't mean a subjective criticism of, I'm going to poke holes in the Bible. It means doing serious historical research. And if you think in terms of that, then you have a far better idea of what textual criticism is all about.
Okay. Well, we talked about how we don't have originals and we've got copies of copies. Well, that's for the New Testament. How do other works of ancient literature pan out? Do we have any originals of any ancient works out there?
I understand we have 2 or 3 sentences from one classical author that it may be the original manuscript, and that's it. Out of the hundreds of classical authors, that's all I have heard about, but I haven't been able to verify that. Here's the real situation, though. The average classical Greek or Latin author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence. In fact, normally it's 2 or 3 copies. The average time we are waiting before we see any of those copies is well over half a millennium, well over 500 years, normally about 900 to 1,000 years before we see one copy of that classical author's writings. Now you compare that with the New Testament, and not only do we have earlier manuscripts significantly, by AD 500, 400 years after the completion of the New Testament, we have hundreds of manuscripts. And when you look at the total number of manuscripts, we have in Greek alone 5,839 New Testament manuscripts. Now, it is true that the very earliest ones, the papyri, are all fragmentary, but those fragments sometimes are as much as 86 leaves or 170 pages for one manuscript. And you add this all together, and we've got an amazing amount of data. Now, beyond the Greek manuscripts, we have these versions. We have somewhere between 15 and 20,000 handwritten manuscripts of the New Testament written in Latin or Coptic or Syriac or Georgian, Gothic, Ethiopic, Old Church Slavonic, all sorts of languages. And then you've got quotations from the church fathers, these scholars and presbyters and bishops of old who wrote commentaries and homilies and theological treatises on the New Testament. And these men were not given to the gift of brevity. They were verbose. We have well over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by these church fathers. If we wiped out all other evidence, we could reproduce the entire New Testament probably many times over just from the writings of the church fathers. We're still trying to sift through all the data that we have on the church fathers. It's enormous, but the earliest ones have been gone through, and the task still is ongoing because there's just so much left to discover. What's typically said about New Testament textual criticism is that we have an embarrassment of riches compared to working with any other ancient source where they have a dearth of data. We are in a pretty plushy situation to have what we've got for the New Testament.
Now, when I was studying philosophy, so when I was in seminary, if we picked up a text by, say, Plato, we never really questioned whether Plato said what was said. Now, we might question whether the manuscript was by Plato. That was understood, but the text was never really called. Well, there's serious doubt right here. It seemed to be just pretty much accepted. And that's the way it usually is for most ancient works, isn't it?
I think so. I think even with the era that we're in right now, moving towards postmodernism at a pretty fast pace. The classics texts are still treated in a way where scholars, of course, they debate whether this word is original or not in that word, and sometimes in fact, frequently, they have to reconstruct the text with no manuscript evidence at all, but they do very plausible reconstructions where it almost surely has to go in that direction. Especially when you're dealing with poets, just like with English, if you're missing the last few words of a line and it has to rhyme with what came previously, in that context, there's only a finite number of options you could go with. And so that's how classic scholars have to deal with these things. But for the most part, they don't say, well, this is what we think Plato said. They say this is what Plato said. This is what Aristotle said. Aristophanes and Sophocles and Euripides and Livy and Suetonius and Tacitus. And these are historians, philosophers, playwrights, biographers that give us that rich data of that era. One of the things I've been exploring in the last couple of years is the whole idea of, well, we have no idea how much they changed the text in those first several generations before we get to the copies. When you're dealing with the classical text, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years, typically, before we see a single copy. You take Herodotus' histories, for example, or Xenophon's Hellenica. We are waiting as much as 1,400 to 1,900 years before we're seeing a single substantial copy of those writings. If you said that about the New Testament, or 1,800 years in the case of Xenophon, if that was the case with the New Testament, our earliest substantial copies would have been written at about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Would anybody think that's authentic? Of course not. But they don't have those kinds of doubts for the classical texts, in part because that's all they have to work with, but also in part because it makes sense. And the same thing applies to the New Testament far greater than it does to the classical text. The message coheres. It's not that you like the message. A lot of scholars are non-Christians, but the message does make sense, and we don't have to come up with hundreds of conjectures, of guesses of what the original text said because we think the original wording is lost.
And we do need to be clear on that. Just because we have a text that is accurately what was said, it doesn't mean the text is true in what it said. We could have 100% textual reliability, and the New Testament could still be false.
That is correct. You're dealing with textual reliability versus historical reliability. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, the manuscripts certainly affirm that. And even if all of our manuscripts agree, even if we had the original writings, that doesn't tell us that he rose from the dead. But at least removes a major question, which is the question that's being asked now. How do you know what God really said? How do you know what the Bible really says? And there are some, like the mythicists, who say Jesus never existed, who would say, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul talks about the tradition handed down to him, and by tradition he means the truth that is respected in all circles by all the apostles. This tradition that was handed down to him was that Jesus was raised from the dead, and there's a certain kind of formula for even reciting that. It's an early Christian creed. And so these mythicists say, well, that's not part of the original text of 1 Corinthians. And what is their basis? There absolutely is no basis except that they don't like it.
Well, I'd like to respond to that, but before I do that, we're going to take a quick break. I'm Nick Peters. My guest is Daniel Wallace, and we will be back after this break.
Can't get enough of your favorite rock radio shows? Well, now you can download episodes for free. Check out the Rock Radio program archive at cyiworldwide.com.
And we're back. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. And if you have a question for Dr. Wallace on the textual reliability of the New Testament, our call-in number is 714-242-5180. And I'm so pleased you brought up the mythicists because it's always one of my favorite things to go on. I just find it such an utter embarrassment to the new atheists when they give any credibility to the mythicist idea. Now, when you said that some people are saying that this is an interpolation, and I'd like you to explain that term as well for my audience when you answer a question. You're thinking mainly of people like Robert Price, I suspect. How much
Yeah,
backing
right.
has he
Robert
gotten
Price
from?
in particular. Yeah.
Yeah. How much? So first off, what do we mean by an interpolation? And second, how much backing has this gotten from the scholarly community, including non-Christian scholars?
An interpolation is an addition added to the text of some substantial length, at least, half a sentence or something like that, maybe a little bit more. And we do have what may be some interpolations in later New Testament manuscripts that I'm sure we'll get into later this hour. But Robert Price, he went to Gordon Conwell Seminary, then he got his doctorate at Drew University. He's a very intelligent fellow, but I'm not sure all the reasons why he became a mythicist. There was a book co-authored by 4 or 5 scholars about the historical Jesus, and James Dunn was one of them. James Dunn is one of the world's great New Testament scholars, and he was responding to Price's views of Jesus never existing, and he said, I'm not sure I'd even heard this view in recent years. The last time I saw it was like a Russian encyclopedia from the 60s, and for some time that was the only place you could find any statement, Jesus never existed. That was it. But he said, this is so loony, it's so absolutely bizarre, and so completely unhistorical. It's hard to imagine that somebody could hold of this. So here's a guy, James Dunn, he knows the secondary literature inside and out. He knows the primary literature. He has read copiously on anything about the New Testament, and he's just taken aback that somebody could actually believe and be a scholar that Jesus didn't exist. Within the scholarly community, you have evangelicals, you have moderates, you have liberals, and then you have extreme radicals on the far left, and you have fundamentalists on the far right. And within that variety, I'd say on the far left is where you're going to find the mythicists. You've got Robert Price, who was on the Jesus Seminar, the second work about whether Jesus did certain things. And I suspect your listeners are familiar with the Jesus Seminar, are they not?
I would hope so. If not, they need to be.
All right. Well, this was started by Robert Funk. He had 84 scholars originally throwing colored beads into a jar, and then they were voting on whether Jesus said something. And if the majority were red, then that meant he definitely said those words. Pink meant that the thoughts go back to him, but not the wording. Gray, probably neither one goes back to him, and black means he definitely didn't say it or think it even. And Robert Price was in on the second group of scholars dealing with the Jesus Seminar and what Jesus did, and his pockets were filled with black beads. Why? Because Jesus didn't exist, so how could he have done anything? Yeah. That was an incredible bias on the Jesus Seminar, which is a group that's not particularly well respected even by liberal scholars.
Now, it's interesting when we talk about the mythicist position, in fact, that this ties in very well with textual criticism, because one of the great critics of the mythicist position, it would actually kind of be considered your main counterpart, I'd say, in the field, and that's Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist in his writings. And now he does textual criticism like you do, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, he's a phenomenal textual critic.
Mm-hmm. He'll tell us that we really can't be sure that we have the originals, that this is kind of up in the air, and the main work he did was in Misquoting Jesus, the first popular book on New Testament criticism to actually make the bestseller list.
So you're asking the best book on textual criticism by Ehrman, or that argues in Ehrman's direction?
No, I'm kind
or
of
against Ehrman?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering what you think about Bart Ehrman then, because he wrote this book about how we don't know what the New Testament said, Misquoting Jesus, made the bestseller list, and he's a textual critic like you are, so shouldn't we be a bit skeptical? Because we got two sides here. One says we know what it says, the other says we don't know. So why should someone go with your side?
Well, it's interesting that Ehrman has moved in that direction. He keeps moving more and more radically to the left, so that he has come out and said we just can't be sure anywhere what the original New Testament text said. And yet, in 2005, he co-authored a book with his mentor, Bruce Metzger. This is the 4th edition of the Standard Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism, called The Text of the New Testament. And in many places there, they say things like there's no need for conjectural emendation in the New Testament, which means we don't have to guess what the original text said because it is found in the manuscripts someplace. And here that was just 9 years ago that Ehrman said that. And he's drifted, I think, further and further to the left. In his scholarly writings, even while he was doing Misquoting Jesus, he would say in scholarly societies, we have virtually come back to the original New Testament in every respect. It's time for us to say we've accomplished the task of textual criticism. Let's move on to other areas. And in popular writings, he'd say we don't have any idea what was written. More recently, when he says we just can't tell what the author actually said in these places, in any place virtually, it really betrays virtually every single book he has written, and he's written quite a few, because in every single other book, he assumes that he knows what the author has written. And this is, in fact, how New Testament scholarship has proceeded the last 2,000 years. The differences between, say, the King James Bible and modern translations in terms of their textual base, which is about as disparate as you get, is only, in terms of translations, probably only about 1,000 places. There's another 4,000 or 5,000 that don't even affect translation. But for a book that has 138,000 words in it, to have only 1,000 differences for the most widely divergent textual traditions is really significant. And so Bart Ehrman, in all of his books, he assumes he knows what the New Testament writers have said, just as patristic scholars from the 2nd century believe they know. And again, there's very, very little difference among them. It's less than 1% difference, basically, you're talking about. And yet, in this latest suggestion, beyond Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman is trying to argue that we just don't know. In my second debate with him that I had at Southern Methodist University in Dallas in 2011, I said, if Bart is right that we can't tell at all what the original New Testament said, then all the rest of his books are wrong. Because, for example, he has a book called Forged, which is about how we know that over half the books of the New Testament were not written by the people that are claimed to have been the writers, and or the names that are attributed. So 6 of Paul's letters are not authentic. Not a single one of the general epistles is authentic. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by other people. This kind of a thing. And so he makes that kind of an argument. And so what I pointed out to him is, on what basis does Bart say that Paul did not write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus? The basis, one of the strongest bases, is the style of writing. It doesn't conform to what we know Paul wrote elsewhere. And so my question was, how do you know what Paul wrote elsewhere if you're now saying that we can't get back to the original wording at all and we have no idea what Paul wrote anywhere? So it's self-defeating. He can't hold to what he says about textual criticism and these other things, and he's written far more books on other areas than he has on textual criticism.
Yeah, in the book edited by Bob Stewart, The Reliability of the New Testament, I really liked how you said, where this is what Bart Ehrman says here, but I'm looking at what he says in other places, and I've read through his introduction to the New Testament, where he says that scholars are sure we can reconstruct the New Testament with reasonable, but probably not 100% accuracy.
Right. And so that's a different
like,
Bart Ehrman from what we're seeing in the popular circles.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like the popular books are written in a way because that kind of stuff sells. Yeah,
and his sold especially because just a few weeks after he wrote it, Jon Stewart put him on The Daily Show and interviewed him, and 2 days later on Amazon, his book was #1. And I think he sold 100,000 copies in the first 3 months. So you get that kind of advertising. It gets books to go sky high. And Stewart said, I could really congratulate you, sir. That's a hell of a book, which is an interesting accolade for a book about the Bible,
Yeah. And I've even come to understand with his moving further left that right now he's saying that he doesn't believe Jesus was buried. It looks like he's moving towards Croissant's idea that Jesus' body was thrown to the dogs.
That's new to me. I haven't read that about. I'm sure Mike Licona knows everything in the world about what Bart Ehrman believes on the resurrection. But yeah, that's pretty amazing to argue that.
And when you were talking about how if his view of textual criticism is right, everything else he's written is wrong. A few weeks ago on March 29th, had Michael Bird, Chris Turing, and Charles Hill all on here, which I'm sure you recognize through the authors of How God Became Jesus. And in that book, Michael Bird says that whenever Bart Ehrman writes something about the historical Jesus, he said, I'm tempted to send him a tweet and say, at Bart Ehrman, epic facepalm. Because if you can't know what the New Testament said, how is it that you can tell us what the historical Jesus was like?
Right. And he's really full of self-contradictions.
Yeah.
But his skepticism seems to know no bounds nowadays, which is sad because he's been a really good scholar over the years, and I have great respect for his scholarship. But his popular writings, that's just a different animal.
In fact, one of my favorite things that I saw him there is that when Chris Turing replies to me, replies that Bart Ehrman thinks that we can get to know what the oral tradition was behind the New Testament, and I'm thinking, okay, you can't know what the New Testament said, but you can know what the tradition, which we have no writings of, behind the New Testament said.
That's right. Yeah, you've got a lot of the contradictions that he's got going.
Yeah.
It is pretty amazing.
What do you think about what Craig Evans has said, that Bart Ehrman is on a flight from fundamentalism?
Oh, I fully agree. Bart and I have been friends since 1982. But my sense is that he still is a fundamentalist, but he's just on the left side of things.
Yeah.
Fundamentalists tend to see things in black or white categories only. And in a lot of the stuff that Bart has written, where he talks about what evangelicals believe, what he's really talking about is what he believed when he was at Moody Bible Institute or Wheaton College. And he honestly has hardly kept up with evangelical scholarship, of which there is a great amount. It was almost an idiosyncratic view of this is what they believe. And so, for example, when we debated in 2011, I've had 3 debates with him on the text of the New Testament, but in that debate, during the Q&A time, he said, well, I'm quite sure that Dan Wallace thinks that everything that's written in John's Gospel that is Jesus' words really are exactly his words. And that's putting in my mouth a view that I do not hold to. In fact, it's very difficult to find any evangelical who holds to that. We would say, certainly the thoughts go back to Jesus, definitely, but John has reworded things. And for Bart to say this shows that he just has really no concept of where evangelical scholarship is. Martin Hengel, who was a great German New Testament scholar and broadly conservative, he was some consider him to be the best German New Testament scholar of the second half of the 20th century. He was that good. Taught at Tübingen University. And Hengel, in his book Issues in Early Christology, very important book on the deity of Christ, really, where he defends the doctrine. He has a little footnote where he says, fundamentalists are those who put their views out there first, and then they seek the evidence and only the evidence which seems to support it. So they've already come to the conclusion, now let's find some evidence that helps. And he said, and we get people like this on both the left and the right. It was a profound statement, because I think Bart has simply changed allegiances, but he hasn't changed his method of how he reads the Bible.
Yeah, this is the exact same kind of methodology I use, terminology I should say I use when I'm describing fundamentalist atheists. Those don't exist. Oh, yes, they most certainly do exist. I run into them regularly. And one thing is it becomes an all or nothing game. And these are kinds of people that say, if I find one contradiction in the Bible, then I can throw the whole thing out of the historical source.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculous. Lee Strobel, when he interviewed me, he asked me the question, "Gee, if you found an error in the Bible, is it going to destroy your faith?" And I just laughed and I said, "Of course not." And that's because Jesus Christ is at the core of my faith. The Bible is, it certainly affirms these great acts of God in history, and I believe that the Bible is both infallible and inerrant, but that doesn't mean that inerrancy is nearly on the same level as my Christology or my doctrine of Christ. They're not even comparable. The Bible did not die for my sins. Jesus Christ did. Those kinds of issues. And I think fundamentalists tend to have what I would call a domino view of doctrine. If one falls down, they all fall down. And if you have inerrancy and a peculiar definition of it, as most fundamentalists do, that it's so rigid it becomes a brittle fundamentalism. When that one falls, then it just knocks over all the rest of them. And I think that's the wrong way to construct our theology. I think our theology has to be based ultimately on the person and work of Jesus Christ, not fundamentally on the Bible, although the Bible certainly attests to the work of Christ and to what the apostles say. We could get into that topic. That's a little different from textual criticism.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about something that Bart Ehrman says, and this is something that a lot of evangelicals get wrong as well, where Bart Ehrman says, there are more variants amongst the New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now, there is some degree of truth to that, but it's also highly misunderstood.
It is true. There are more variants than there are words in the New Testament. In fact, he's really, in some ways, understated the case. I believe there are as many as 400,000 textual variants among our New Testament manuscripts. For a text that has originally only 138,000 plus some change words in it, that means that we've got about 2.5 variants for every word. But here's what some evangelicals have done with the data, and I need to maybe go in two directions with this. The first thing they've done, and this goes back to a book written in 1965, where a lot of evangelicals and apologists especially have picked up on this. This person, his name was David Lightfoot, I believe, wrote this book where he said the way you count a textual variant is if you have 500 manuscripts that say Jesus in one place and 500 that say the Lord in the same place as a variant, that counts as 500 variants from Jesus. Well, I'm not sure how he came up with that, but it's never what textual critics have said, and yet the number of variants comes from textual critics who have worked this out. A variant is any difference between a base text and at least one manuscript. If you have one manuscript or 1,000 manuscripts that have the different wording, it still counts as just a single variant. So in Lightfoot's approach, he could say, well, if we've got, in his day, he thought there were about 200,000 variants. If you've got, 500 manuscripts on one side, then that means we might only have 400 or so actual textual variants, textual wording differences in the New Testament manuscripts, which is preposterous. You go through a good critical apparatus of what the manuscripts have to say, and there are variants in almost every single verse. Now, having said that, the significance of these is the other side of it. If I just said, hey, we got 400,000 variants among our manuscripts, 2.5 variants per word, and I said, it was nice talking to you, Nick, I got to go. That would be disastrous, and it would be really telling not even half the story, because the rest of the story is this. How many of those textual variants are actually meaningful and viable? That is, that they affect the meaning of the text to some degree, and there is some plausibility that they actually go back to the original wording. The vast majority of our textual variances are spelling differences, over 70%. Spelling differences don't affect anything. And so that's the largest category. Then we've got things like transposition, because word order differences in Greek don't necessarily affect the meaning, they just affect the emphasis. And we've got some other differences that are so minor that they can't even be translated. And then we've got some that are not viable. That is, they're not found in significant or early enough manuscripts to be considered authentic. When you count all three of those categories, we're dealing with 99.75% of all the texture variants we've got are either not meaningful or not viable or both. So we're dealing with 1/4 of 1% of the variants that are both meaningful and viable. That brings us to about 1,000 variants. And guess what? We have about 1,000 variants where we're just not sure, and it does affect the meaning of the text.
Mm-hmm.
So it's way down from 400,000.
Yeah. We're going to expand that a little bit when we get back. For now, we got to take a quick break. I'm Nick Peters with Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. We'll be back after this break.
Check out CYIWorldwide.com. CYIWorldwide.com. Home of Grok Radio. Free music downloads, advice, prayer, and support. CYIWorldwide.com. Do you grok?
And we're back. I'm Nick Peters. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. We're talking about textual criticism. And I first found out about what you were saying, in fact, about these variance curves. Mike Lacone and I were listening to a speaker in Georgia who mentioned that if we have 3,000 manuscripts that differ in one word, then that counts as 3,000 variants. and Mike leaned over me and said, "That's not right." Now, and I said, "What? That's what I read from Metzger in Strober's book." And he said, "Yeah, Dan Wallace taught me about it. That's not right." And as soon as I got back home, I said, I emailed you, said, "Dr. Wallace, is Mike right here?" He said, "Yep, Mike's right." And I had to go to the class I'd been teaching on Skype, and we'd just gone over textual reliability of the New Testament. I said, "Guys, I'm sorry, I told you something that's not correct. Let's get this correct view out there."
Well, it's important for evangelicals, because of their faith, to seek the truth and speak the truth, even if it looks like it hurts their faith. Mm-hmm. After all, there are some things that we believe that may not be true on a minor level. I like to say to my students, all of us are heretics with a lowercase h, but it's when it becomes a capital H that you're in trouble. And with a lowercase h, you may hold to things that are minor differences among one another. How you do baptism, what day Jesus died, what year he died. Those kinds of issues. The role of women in the church is not an essential for salvation. It's very, very important to women, but it's not an essential for salvation. All sorts of things like that where we have disagreements with one another. But the fact is that it's the major things that we would agree on that is really important, and we need to pursue the truth even when it looks like it hurts our view. And I think if we can do that, it adds to our credibility. And to try to come up with a faulty view of how many textual variants there are, or to at least promote that view even when you know that it's not true, or without doing real research, I don't think that honors the Lord.
Yeah. There's been an image going around of you on Facebook with the caption of, "Be a seeker of truth before you're a defender of it."
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
I try to tell my students at all times that you have to pursue the truth and pursue the evidence wherever it leads.
Now, you said that we have some variants that are meaningful, that do affect the meaning of the text. How much of essential Christian doctrine is in danger because of these variants?
It's really interesting how to answer that question, and I can make it very simple. I can say with a great deal of assurance that not a single cardinal doctrine of the Christian faith is jeopardized by any of these viable variants. Mm-hmm. Now, I can say that, and by the way, I was virtually quoting Bart Ehrman, who says that in the appendix, or the kind of a Q&A section of the paperback version of his Misquoting Jesus. Mm-hmm. That's what he said there, where the editors of the book said, "Now, why is it that you disagree with your mentor, Bruce Metzger, that the variants don't affect any doctrines?" And he said, "Well, I don't agree with Metzger. I agree that no essential doctrine is jeopardized by any viable variant." Mm-hmm. And so the 3 times I've debated him, that's how I've ended my debate, by quoting from him. I could have done that really early on, but the whole debate would have lasted about 5 minutes. But I use him to say, hey, look, even a guy like Bart Ehrman agrees no essential doctrine is jeopardized by these variants.
Now, that's the simple answer, I think you were saying. What's the complex answer?
Well, what you're dealing with in these manuscripts is a number of issues that we need to look at that do affect textual reliability in certain issues. I would say that matters of orthopraxy, which is not orthodoxy, but it's how we ought to live, are impacted by these textual variants to a very minor degree. What we say about what an author means in a given place is hugely impacted. It affects exegesis. That's the real thing that is impacted by these textual variants. So let me just give 2 examples. In Mark 9:29, Jesus tells his disciples who were unsuccessful in doing a particular exorcism that this kind of demon cannot be cast out except by prayer, and the majority of later manuscripts add, and fasting. So it's the one place, if we add those words, and fasting, where Jesus said, in order to do certain kind of exorcisms, to cast out certain pesky demons, you've got to both pray and fast. And it's not found in all the manuscripts. It's not found in the earliest witnesses, the best ones. So the issue here is what is important to do when we're involved in this kind of an exorcism. Well, do I just pray, or should I pray and fast? And that's the perhaps the largest issue of orthopraxy that I have found jeopardized or impacted by the textual variants. Now, I don't know too many people that are going around doing exorcisms all the time, but it's probably a good hedge to say, well, at least I need to pray, and probably wouldn't hurt to fast, even if that's not required. So that's about it for orthopraxy. Now, in terms of beliefs and how the variants affect various meanings in the text, Revelation chapter 13:18 is a great passage to discuss. There we read that the number of the Antichrist is 666. And we have 2 manuscripts, one discovered in 1999. It's now the earliest manuscript for this passage, and one that was deciphered in 1843 and 1844. These 2 manuscripts, and only these 2, have the number 616 for the number of the beast. So that really raises an interesting question. Is the number of the Antichrist 666, or is it 616? And most scholars today, even though these 2 manuscripts are extraordinarily important for Revelation, most would say, 616, no, that's not the number of the beast. That's the neighbor of the beast. He lives just a few doors down, But at the same time, if you went on the Internet and you Googled 666, you would get probably 10 million hits from some of the wackiest people out there who are telling us what is the fulfillment of this. What happens if 666 is not the actual number of the beast? We just sent 7 tons of popular Christian literature to the flames,
Yeah, I've posted some recently that when 2016 comes, I want to go into a Christian bookstore and ask for John Hagee's book on blood moons and see what happens.
Right.
When we've been talking about this orthopraxy, one thing that came to my mind immediately that does involve a clear textual variant is that in Tennessee, where we live, we had a story a few months ago, and I was very livid that the guy got off the hook with this snake handler who was on the Snake Salvation show and had been arrested because he'd had snakes without a warrant, without proper licensing to hold them, more than 50 of them, and some of them were not in very good condition. And Ingrid, my wife, as well, since she's an animal lover, and she also likes snakes, which is odd for most women, I think. But some people are going through this and saying, well, the Bible says they shall take up serpents, they shall take up serpents, and I'm listening to I'm thinking, no it doesn't, no it doesn't.
Yeah, you get that in the West Virginia Appalachians and Tennessee kind of backwoods Christianity, but you can see videos on the internet of these folks handling these snakes. And I had some students who visited a fellow in Tennessee, one of these pastors, and they said, "Do you really use snakes in your service?" He said, "Oh yeah, I got one right here." He pulls one out from underneath his chair. It was a rattlesnake, and it's a big honking thing sitting there. He just grabs it and kind of petting it, things, and put it back down. That's just a loony view of the Christian faith to think that that's where we're supposed to be spending any of our time.
Yeah, but some people are going to say, "Well, how can I say that's not in the New Testament? I open up my Bible, there it is, in the end of Mark 16, it says they shall take up serpents, so there it is in the New Testament."
Well, my response would be what Dean Alford said back in the 1850s. He was the Archdeacon of Canterbury, and he wrote a commentary on every book of the New Testament. And he said, even the most precious belief, the most precious passage, needs to be given up to historical evidence. And we should sacrifice those passages if they do not have a solid basis in the original text. Mark 16 is a classic text that I would say does not have a basis in the original text, and here's why. When you look at the manuscripts externally, you've got, for example, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, two great manuscripts from the 4th century. Those are our oldest manuscripts for this passage, for the end of Mark's Gospel, and neither one of them has verses 9 through 20, the passage about picking up snakes, drinking poison, speaking in tongues, all this. And then you look at the oldest versions, and we have the Latin and the Coptic and the Syriac and others that either don't have these last 12 verses, or they have them added later on. For example, the Armenian, I think there's 99 Armenian manuscripts, the oldest ones, that do not have these 12 verses. That's extraordinary. Or then you look at what the Church Fathers have to say, and you go all the way back to Clement and Origen, two guys from the late 2nd and 3rd century, and they don't even recognize this passage. They don't talk about it at all. They're silent about it. Now, maybe that they knew about it and just didn't discuss it, or maybe that they're just completely silent about it. We're not sure. But you get to Irenaeus, who may well be the first guy who quoted from it in the second half of the 2nd century. So we know that these 12 verses existed at that time. But when you get just a little bit later to Eusebius in the beginning of the 4th century, he talks about these 12 verses, and he says, they are not found in the vast majority of manuscripts that I have access to. Now, he was writing or producing 50 Bibles for the capital city of Constantinople under the order of Constantine the Great. And so as he's producing these, he has to come to terms with these 12 verses. He says, I just can't find it in most manuscripts. That's an extraordinary statement, because he's not somebody who's doing this out in the boonies. He's got a commission from the first Christian emperor, and he has access to Origen's manuscripts in his library, and he has access to tons of things. And he says, I just can't find it in most manuscripts. Then towards the end of the 4th century, you have Jerome saying the same thing in the West as he's producing the Latin Vulgate for the Vatican. And so here's, in fact, Jerome goes so far as to say it's not found in Greek manuscripts except very rarely. And so he adds the word Greek, which shows that he's not just mimicking Eusebius, but he's making this kind of a statement himself. So that's the external evidence. It's very compelling. The early evidence says this text did not exist. And then you have the internal evidence. And here, where you look at the stylistic features, the syntactical features, the vocabulary, thematic features, this passage just doesn't fit with the rest of Mark's gospel. And so the internal evidence and the external evidence combined are telling us Mark's gospel did not have anything after verse 8. So that's how scholars look at this. They're not saying, oh, here's a passage I don't like. Let me see if I can drum up some reasons to get rid of it. That's not at all what happens. They're really trying to follow the historical evidence, and the evidence simply is not there to argue that this passage is authentic.
Yeah, it's so amusing when I see internet atheists arguing and saying, well, now we know if this passage isn't authentic, and I'm going to say, you are about 17 or 1800 years behind the times. The early church knew this just as well.
Right. And there are some scribes that even comment, put in the marginal note, that Eusebius canonized this book till here, to verse 8, but other manuscripts have this, and then they go on and write verses 9 through 20. So even if they add those verses, that doesn't necessarily mean that they think they're authentic. It's not just numbers that we're counting. We're looking at the actual evidence, and manuscripts have to be weighed, not counted, and all the evidence has to be weighed, not counted. And so we go back, the earlier we go, that those 12 verses don't look authentic.
So what do you think is going on at the end of Mark? I mean, do you think Mark just purposely ended his gospel that way, or do you think the ending is lost? What's your theory?
Well, the argument that the ending was lost, which is, it's certainly a plausible view. It's not one I take, though. But it's really based on, if I recall, about 3 points. First is the Greek here ends with the word for, or the Greek word is gar. And the last 2 words of verse 8 are ephobunta gar, for they were afraid. Scholars for a long time said books don't end in a gar. And then some scholars have been able to look at some classical literature and other places, and they say, actually, we do find a few books that do end in a gar. It is very rare. But they also have found, more importantly, paragraphs that end in this word. And in Greek, the word for it has to be a post-positive. That means it can't be the first word in the sentence, so it can be something that comes a little bit later. And although rare, it does occur. So the second argument is, they say, and this to me is the weakest argument for those who hold that the actual ending of Mark's gospel is lost. They say, if this was written on a codex, our modern book form, that are bound on one side, and you got cut pages that you can turn. If this was written on a codex, then the outside leaves would be the most susceptible to damage. And they're certainly right about that. If you have a paperback book in your library that you've taken to the beach or someplace like that a few times, those outside leaves, the cover probably have fallen off, and that kind of stuff is really susceptible just to loss. And so these scholars say, therefore, the ending of Mark's gospel probably was lost. Well, let's think about that for a moment. We have a couple problems with it. One is that both Matthew and Luke, probably independently of each other, this is still the largely consensus view, probably independently of each other, used Mark's gospel. And if so, that means that the copy that they used had to have the loss at exactly the same place. That's just unbelievable. And Matthew and Luke both deviate from one another after Mark 16:8, which is really significant. And so that tells us that even the copy they're copying didn't have anything past verse 8. But the second issue is this. The codex form was invented, it's true, in the late first century. But as far as we can tell, there is zero evidence that any of the New Testament books was originally written on a codex. It was just starting to take off. A scroll would have been the form that would be used. And so scrolls in the ancient times would be rolled up, just like back when we had Blockbuster videos. You had to rewind the video, or you have to pay a denarius at your Blockbuster video store. Same thing with these scrolls. Of the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been found, hundreds of them, only one of them was not found to have been rolled up afterwards. That's significant. That tells us that that last portion is the most protected leaf of anything in that manuscript. So that argument just doesn't wash. And then the third argument they raise is a literary one, that the modern endings that really are not conclusions are basically a Kafka-like story. Well, there was a fellow named Lee Magnus who did his doctoral dissertation on the ending of Mark's Gospel, and he did it on a literary basis where he searched Greco-Roman and Jewish sources, and he found quite a bit of material of other works that did not have a conclusion to them. One of the sources was the book of Jonah. Here you got Jonah going to Nineveh, preaching repentance. All these people repent. Then at the end of the book, he's sitting under a tree. The leaves dry up. The sun beats down on him, and he's complaining. And that's the end of the narrative. You go, oh, my gosh, what a downer. But that's an open-ended story that tells the Jews, what are you going to do about your enemies? Are you going to try to love them? Are you going to try to win them for Israel, or are you going to just try to hate them and complain about you not getting enough shade? Mark's gospel does the same thing. He's concluding this gospel in such a way that says, okay, reader, what are you going to do? If you want to see Jesus in his glory, you must accept him in his suffering. And that also means you must take up your cross daily and follow him. And I think what Mark did was an absolutely brilliant move to leave it open like that so that the reader keeps on reading. There's nothing left to read, but now the reader has to put himself in the shoes or the sandals of those apostles and decide for himself what he's going to do with Jesus.
All right. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to ask about another passage as well. I'm Nick Peters, and this is my guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. We'll be back after this break.
It's here, the official Rock Radio mobile app. Listen to your favorite rock radio shows on your Apple or Android-powered devices. Best of all, it's absolutely free. So get it now in the Google Play or iTunes App Store, or grab a link at CYIWorldwide.com.
And we're back. I'm Nick Peters. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. And if he's here this week, but if you're listening next week, we're going to have another guest on, and it's someone I know Dr. Wallace really likes a lot, and that's going to be Dr. Craig Blomberg is going to be my guest. Again.
He's a terrific guy.
Oh, yeah. And we're going to be talking about a book that you reviewed a little bit called Can We Still Believe the Bible? So that's coming up next week. Now,
that's great. You've got a great scholar coming on the show.
Yeah, he's been on before to talk about his book, Historical Reliability of the Gospels, and he's gracious enough to come back again. Now, you said that we're not cutting out a story we don't like. There is one story a lot of us do like, though, and that's the story in John 7:53 to John 8-11 of the woman caught in adultery. Most of us love that story. That story preaches very well. It shows Jesus very well. The only problem is it looks like John never wrote it.
Right. I'd have to say the story of the woman caught in adultery is my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. It's interesting that it actually has worse credentials than the long ending of Mark's Gospel. And over the years, when I speak in churches, I'll ask people, if you had to cut out one of these two passages and keep the other one, which one would you cut out? And it's about 99.9% of folks say, I'd get rid of Mark 16. I've had two people who felt, well, that's the one I'd keep. I'd get rid of the John 8 passage. This is a passage we love. Mark 16 is a passage not so much. And yet the evidence for Mark 16 being authentic is about 10 times greater than the evidence for this passage. And still, the evidence for Mark 16 is not at all adequate to make scholars say, yeah, this is authentic. Here's a passage in John 8 that we have only one manuscript, if I recall, in the first 800 years of the church that has the text. In the first millennium, the great majority of the manuscripts, until we get to the very end of that, don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery. Our earliest manuscripts for this portion of John, P66 and P75, two extraordinarily early and important papyri, Codex Vaticanus from the 4th century, Sinaiticus from the 4th century, Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th, and Ephraemi Rescriptus from the 5th. You've got these manuscripts. These 6 manuscripts are the earliest we have here, and not one of them has the story of the woman caught in adultery, nor are they making room for it. So you start looking at the evidence, and it's extremely compelling that it was not authentic. The Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts has discovered, I'm not sure what the number is, but it's probably close to about 10 more manuscripts, later manuscripts from the second millennium for the most part, that don't have this story. The longer we go through church history, the more we get manuscripts that do have it. And yet when you look at lectionaries, which are responsive reading texts for the church, kind of like what you get in the back of an Episcopalian hymnal, you have, the pastor reads something and then the rest of the congregation reads another portion of the scripture. Well, those lectionaries don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery either. And then you look at the internal evidence, and what's really fascinating here is that it just doesn't look like Johannan's style. This, again, is something where the syntax and the vocabulary and the style are different from John. There's one other consideration that I think is very significant, and that is that this is a floating passage. It appears after John 7:52. It also appears in some manuscripts somewhere else in John 7. It appears at the end of all four Gospels in several manuscripts, and between Luke and John in others, and after Luke 21:38 in a group of others. Floating texts normally tell us that there's some kind of a textual disruption, and the very fact that it's a floating text also says it's not that the early church said, oh, we don't want to have this passage in our Bibles because it would promote adultery, since Jesus simply forgives this adulterous woman, because it shows up in other places. One of the manuscripts that we discovered in Eastern Europe, when we got to this passage, it wasn't there. The scribe did not write it. It was like a 12th century manuscript. And about 300 years later, some other scribe comes along and was so mad that the original scribe did not put the passage in, that he stitched in with 5 very large stitches, not at all an elegant job, right to the next page, a paper sheet, and he scribbled out the story of the woman caught in adultery on that paper sheet. And it was probably a pastor or something like this, because on the back side of that sheet, then you see the whole story again scribbled out in a child's hand. He's probably got this manuscript at home. He's complaining about it, and he writes out the story. And when he's away from home, his child comes along and scribbles out the text again. It's just amazing, the humanity of what you can see these scribes doing. But the evidence is so compelling that it's not authentic, and yet it's a story that we love because of what it speaks about for the grace and the mercy of our Lord.
Do you think this is a true story?
I think that it's largely true. I don't think all the details are true, but I have a student, a fellow by the name of Kyle Hughes. He was one of my master's students, and now he's working on his doctorate at the University of Virginia. And he did a couple of papers for me last year that when he was still in the master's program that dealt with this story. One was a course on Greek grammar, and the other one was on textual criticism. And he came to the conclusion, it was really a remarkable conclusion, that probably a truncated version of the story Luke had access to. This may be the reason that it shows up after Luke 21:38. But and the evidence that he has is really very, very significant. And so Luke decides not to put the story in, probably because it's a little bit too vanilla of a story. It's not that some woman was caught in adultery, she was just caught in some sin. And the Pharisees do not peel off from the oldest to the youngest. That was apocryphal. But he's gotten this published, I believe it was in Novum Testamentum, a very important journal, international journal for New Testament studies, that the story of the woman caught in adultery, the source of it ultimately goes back to Luke's source that he used for parts of his gospel. I think he's right. I think Kyle Hughes has done a profound argument, and this is going to move the discussion further down the road. So that means that that part of the story, the main elements of it were true, or are true, but that doesn't mean that the whole thing as it stands now is true.
Now, let's talk about another textual variant, because you had said the person who helped get you into this was an Arian, and you know there's a great passage of Scripture we could use to defend the Trinity, found in 1 John 5:7, where it says the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are in heaven, and these three are one. And strangely enough, it only shows up in the King James Bible, which I guess shows the King James, so it has to be the one true Bible. And yeah, this is a passage so many evangelicals would love to have in their Bibles, since it'd be a good help with the Trinity. It doesn't prove the Trinity. It could work with modalism, but it'd be a really good help to have. But yet, you're very skeptical of this one, aren't you?
Oh, I'm not skeptical. I'm sure it's not authentic, and so are, I would say, all textual critics today. There are some people who know some Greek and are not scholars, but they would say this is authentic. But there's not a single textual critic that I know of today who would say these verses are authentic. This is something that, when you got these three are one, and you've got in heaven, you've got the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. this is, as you said, it's close to the most explicit Trinitarian formula we have in the New Testament, although not exactly. And it never appeared in the debates over how to define the Trinity in the early centuries, especially in the Greek church, where you'd expect it to be discussed because of the syntax of the Greek. And it never shows up on the radar at all. And you go, how is that possible? If this is the most explicit passage on the Trinity in the New Testament, why did they ever mention this one? That becomes significant. But the more important issue here is that this is a passage that is not found in any manuscripts from the first millennium. And it's in fact found only in 9 manuscripts that we know of today. 4 of them have it actually in the text, and the oldest of these is from the 14th century. And then 5 have it as a marginal reading added because they didn't like what the scribe originally wrote, most likely. And so you've got 9 manuscripts out of the hundreds we have for 1 John, all of them late, 5 of them in the margins. It just doesn't have any credibility whatsoever.
No, I remember in Case for Real Jesus, Strobel asked you about what new atheist Frank Zindler said, that without this verse, Christians are left without a defense of a Trinity.
Oh my, that's so silly. Because the church for the first 1,000 years did not have this verse. It actually probably came from a Latin document that made its way into Greek. So in the 8th century, it was already found in Latin, and then it got into Greek. But here's the interesting thing about this. This verse was not included in the first printed Greek New Testament done by a fellow named Erasmus. He was a contemporary with Martin Luther, and he published the first Greek New Testament in March of 1516. It didn't have this Trinitarian formula there. He followed the modern versions. And then in 1519, he published his second one. Well, by that time, the Catholic Church was squawking about it, saying, hey, why did you put this in there? And he said, I didn't put it in because I didn't find it in any manuscripts. Now, he didn't say that he would put it in if he did, but it seemed to be implied. And so in 1520, there was a scribe working at Oxford University, a scribe by the name of Roy or Froy, working on a manuscript, and it just so happened to have this passage in it. It was called the Comma Johanneum, or the Trinitarian formula. And Erasmus suddenly discovered this manuscript at his doorstep. And so he gets this text published in his 3rd edition of 1522, precisely because he did find it in a Greek manuscript, the one that was apparently especially produced for him. What's really interesting here... What's that?
Was the ink dry on it yet?
Yeah, right. Just barely. That manuscript is now housed at Trinity College in Dublin, and it's written on paper, and all the pages in it are very clean until you start getting to this place. For the 2 or 3 pages before it gets real dark, hands have handled it, and there's wax drippings everywhere until you get right to 1 John 5:7, and then it's all over the place, because that's what everybody has searched for. That manuscript has been consulted so often at that point that if you just lay it on its back and let it fall open, it's going to naturally fall open to this place. So Erasmus publishes this in his 3rd edition, but really kind of under protest. And here he says, I didn't publish anything because unless I found it in a Greek manuscript. Well, he didn't even publish what Roy had put, because Roy didn't know Greek very well, and so he was translating from Latin into Greek, and Erasmus actually had to correct the Greek in 3 places at 1 John 5:7 from the manuscript he had. So even still, what ends up in the Greek text behind the King James Bible was not found in any manuscript.
Now, when we're talking more about the history of the New Testament manuscripts, there is one piece that's been talked about a lot lately, and my friends of the Christian Apologetics have been wanting me to ask you about this, and I know you might not be able to say much, but there is a rumor that there is a 1st century copy of Mark. What can you tell us about this? I
could affirm that there is that rumor. This is something that I have signed a non-disclosure on and can neither affirm nor deny its existence.
Do you have any idea when we will be hearing something new on the matter at this point, or not?
Well, even on that, I've signed the non-disclosure, so I can't even discuss whether it's going to be published or when more news will be coming out. Only when it comes out if there is anything that comes out, then I can talk about it.
Okay, if this does not be authentic, we can have no doubt this will rock the world of textual criticism, won't it?
I think it would have a huge impact, yeah.
Okay. Now, when we're talking about this kind of thing going on, let's look a little bit at something you'd said about Eusebius having to write 50 manuscripts of the Bible. Now, there are, once again, in the case of real Jesus, you had the idea of, say, Bajan and Lay being given to you about how Constantine then took that upon himself to change everything in the Bible, as it were, and get the Bible that he wanted out there for the public to have. And I think you're probably seeing they're rolling your eyes right now.
Oh, yeah, that's just such nonsense. Well, these guys also said that there were no manuscripts before the 4th century. Mm-hmm. And you go, really? There's between 48 and 61 manuscripts just in Greek before the 4th century of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And you have plenty of them that affirm the deity of Christ.
Well, let's suppose that there was, let's suppose, say, Matthew writes his gospel. And we'll just say Matthew for the sake of argument, where I'm sure a lot of my atheist listeners out there will be saying, well, we don't know who wrote them. Let's suppose whoever wrote it, okay? They get out there, and this manuscript's copied by 2 people. One copies it very, very well, and one copies it very, very poorly. How do we know that we don't have the poor manuscripts being copied in abundance and the good one has been lost to history?
It's a great question. I think part of it is if you have a manuscript that's copied well from a poor tradition, you'll be able to tell it comes from a poor tradition. And there are a number of ways to do this, but let me give one illustration that I think kind of encapsulates all of this. The manuscript Codex Washingtonianus, or Codex W, which is housed at the Smithsonian Institution and was discovered by Charles Freer or he brought it home from Egypt in 1906. It's a manuscript of the 4 Gospels, and Henry Sanders, the first editor of this, a few years later, published on the document. He said, this is a most unusual manuscript because it follows different textual families where it breaks off in the middle of a verse and then it picks up with another kind of a textual family. Textual families are, if you think of like the NIV and the King James Bible and the RSV as 3 textual families, you for the most part, if you heard any one of those being read out loud in church, you could identify which one of those 3 it was. So these textual families are basically the same kind of a thing where the wording is going to be different in some places, but we get a certain kind of pattern of readings. And before the printing press, this is how you might want to think about these things. Mm-hmm. So you've got these the textual families that are different. Now, I'm sorry, I just had a brain fart, and this is a long weekend for me. I can't even remember the topic we're talking about. Nick, so remind me if you would. Oh, I know, it's about the scribes, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not writing any of this.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, it was that. How do we know that maybe a bad copy didn't get passed down instead of a good copy?
Right. Okay. Well, obviously, these scribes had a better memory than I did, or else they'd be making the same kind of mistakes I do. But what you have in this particular manuscript, Codex W, Henry Sanders said this was a patchwork manuscript put together from portions of Gospels that were found after the Diocletian persecution of Christians at the beginning of the 4th century. And Codex W is dated late 4th, perhaps early 5th century. And so Sanders is arguing this. Now, there was a student of mine, Zachary Cole, who did his master's thesis on the use of numbers in this particular manuscript. And this is a significant issue. He discovered, without knowing originally about the different text types or different families that Codex W seems to be representing. For example, it might be Byzantine in Matthew's Gospel, and then it starts to get to be Alexandrian in Mark, and then switches to Western or something like that. So you've got these different text types right in the middle of it. All the world looks like it's a patchwork book put together from manuscripts that were partially destroyed during the Diocletian persecution. And so Zach is working in these numbers, and the way numbers were written in the ancient manuscripts, in literary documents, they were always written out completely. In non-literary documents, they would usually use the Greek letters for the numbers. So alpha would stand for 1, beta would be number 2. They'd put a line over the letter to say, don't read this as a word, but read it as something else, which in this case means a number. And what Zach discovered is that whether the numbers were written out as words or as letters depended on where you were in this manuscript. And he sent me an email early on in his research, and his research was really trying to deal with something else, but he said, it's interesting, Codex W doesn't follow one pattern. It has these 4 different patterns. And I checked, and I found that it fits exactly at the breaks that Henry Sanders said were the different texts that it follows. This tells us that this scribe is not trying to reinvent what he has, but he is such a faithful scribe to the text in front of him that he even writes the numbers out fully if it has it, or he writes them as letters if it doesn't. And yet, we can tell the difference in the quality of the text forms, of the 4 different text forms in this manuscript, by a number of other means. And that includes the looseness of the paraphrase. It has to do with if a reading is, in particular, a harder reading. It doesn't fit into the author's style, or if a harder reading, if it doesn't fit into our idea of what the author should have written, and if it's maybe harder theologically for the scribes, that kind of thing. Those are the readings that we find typically in the Alexandrian text form, which is what most scholars would believe to be the best one. So there's a number of criteria that we use, and you can even tell on a manuscript like Codex W, here's where the scribe was faithful to 4 different traditions, although one of them is really a good tradition, the other's not quite so good.
Okay. We're going to take a break here. When we're back, and we're going to be asking a few questions about this copying process. I'm Nick Peters. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. We'll be back after this break.
Hey, this is Minister Grok. Thanks for listening. Although Grok Radio is free, there are costs to upkeep the website, podcasts, and purchase Bibles and materials for street ministry. And while we are happy to pay this ourselves out of pocket, we will gladly accept any gifts if you feel led to support the shows and our street ministry. You could send a gift or love offering through our website at cyiworldwide.com. Thanks for your support, and God bless.
And we're back with our guest, Dr. Daniel Wallace. And I'd like to remind people that, yes, everything we do here is listener-supported. I don't get paid a penny for what I'm doing here. And I'm certainly not able, unfortunately, to pay my guests a penny. I'd love to be able to, but I can't. Now, if you want to support what I'm doing, you can go to my blog at deeperwaters.wordpress.com, and there you'll find a link where it says donate. And from there, you can get to my Ratio Christi page and make a donation, become a partner with there. Everything you donate in that way is tax deductible. So what do you have to lose there? You're supporting great ministry going on here. At least I hope you think it's great ministry, and you get a nice tax deduction. Now, Dr. Wallace, you're doing some work that needs some support too. Would you care to tell what that is and how our listeners can support it?
Yes, it's called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, or CSNTM. If you remember C.S. Lewis, and then Anti-M of Wizard of Oz, you've got C.S. Anti-M. So, and that's csntm.org is where we actually have pictures of manuscripts. We've existed for the last 12 years. We're also a tax deductible group, a 401k, and we go all around the world to digitize Greek New Testament manuscripts and post the images online so that scholars and interested parties can look at them. We've taken well over 250,000 images, pictures so far of each page of these manuscripts. And last summer we photographed the oldest manuscript of Paul's letters in existence. It's called P46. This is in in Dublin, and it's about AD 200. It's very, very old. And then we shot the oldest manuscript of Mark's Gospel and of Revelation and some other manuscripts at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. But if someone wants to donate to our work, which it obviously requires a great deal of funding for us to digitize every single Greek New Testament manuscript, make them available to scholars so that we can finally get back more confidently to the original wording of the New Testament in every single place. They should simply go to csntm.org, and there's a bullet that you can click on, a window you can click on called Donations. And we are much appreciating of any kind of support for that. Thank you.
Now, when we were talking about how scribes copy the New Testament, how exactly was this going on? What exactly was the process used to copy a text?
Well, there's a couple of things to consider here. When we think about Old Testament manuscripts, we hear the story about how the scribes would not let the letters touch, and when they said the divine names, they would actually have to get a new pen for Elohim, and they'd have to take a bath every time they wrote Adonai. So what you actually get in the manuscripts is they have these medieval requirements, at least. And so there's a lot of places where there's blank spaces in the manuscripts that are then filled in, and sometimes it doesn't look quite right. But what most likely happened is the scribes would go and take a bath and get a new pen and then fill in all those places and only those, So that's why we have some distinction in our manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts, between God and Lord, if you will, Elohim and Adonai. And so we have textual variants there where the original manuscripts are a little bit clearer. So when it comes to the New Testament, though, the care was not nearly as great as that, not at least until we get to the much later manuscripts from about the 9th century on. And it's interesting that Bart Ehrman has argued that the older manuscripts were not done by professional scribes, and therefore they're not nearly as reliable, and consequently we've got all these manuscripts that simply were done by bad scribes because they're not professional. Well, again, I want to quote from Zach Cole's master's thesis. I don't know if I mentioned, but he's working on his doctorate now in textual criticism at the University of Edinburgh. And he went through and actually examined Ehrman's thesis about unprofessional scribes who were careless because they weren't professional versus professional. And here's what he said. He said, what is most noteworthy is the amount of reliable texts from the documentary category, which is a lower stratum of actual good handwriting and professionalism. And he goes through and lists manuscripts, P20, P22, these are all papyri, P23, 27, 28, 49, 65, 91, 92, 106, 111, 114, P75, and then he lists a bunch of others as well. All these papyri, he says, these were produced by unprofessional scribes, and yet the manuscript that they produced, even though it may not look real good, was very, very accurate. And one of the classic illustrations of this is between P66 and P75. I mentioned those two earlier about the story of the woman caught in adultery. P66 is dated about 175 to 200, and P75 is early 3rd century, so a little bit later than P66. P66 was produced by a scribe in a scriptorium. It was professionally produced. It's beautiful. It's aesthetic. And so this manuscript is professionally done. P75 was written by a non-professional scribe for personal use, and yet it's far more accurate than P66. P75 was written one letter at a time, and the handwriting looks like chicken scratches. It doesn't really look elegant at all. Ernest Codman Caldwell, who was not a Christian but was one of the finest textual critics of the 20th century, did a study on the hand of both of these manuscripts and P46, and he says P66, quote, seems to reflect a scribe working with the intention of making a good copy, falling into careless errors, particularly the error of dropping a letter, a syllable, a word, or even a phrase where it is doubled. P66 is careless and ineffective, although he is the only calligrapher of the three. And so this is significant that he would make this point, because it shows that Ehrman's statement that unprofessional scribes produced unreliable manuscripts is simply not true. The evidence doesn't bear that out. Sometimes you have professional scribes that don't, and you have unprofessional scribes that do, or it could be the other way around. But the quality of the handwriting doesn't give us any indication about the reliability of the manuscript. That needs to be determined on other bases.
You know, one of the points we could say about that, if I'm copying a work for you, I might not be as careful, but if I'm doing it for my own personal use and I'm depending on that copy, I want to make sure that I've got the right thing many times.
Yeah, there's illustrations like that are significant. That the calligraphy, the aesthetics of the scribe of P66, he was completely consumed by making pretty letters, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't consumed with making an accurate text. And yet, even using that text, those kinds of mistakes, for the most part, can be identified, and we can find out what text he was copying. So let me give this as an illustration, too. The kinds of errors that these early scribes do make are, at least as far as the evidence that we have in the 2nd and 3rd century, are not errors of massive changes to the text. The vast majority of them are errors where they just make a mistake, a spelling mistake, or a word order change or something like that, or dropping an article or a syllable, like Caldwell said. It would be like saying you have two scribes who are copying out the preamble to the Constitution, and one of them just doesn't even care what's being written, and so he doesn't care at all. It's not even recognizable. The other guy is very, very careful. And at the same time, he doesn't proofread his work, and he might not be a good speller. And so he starts out with a preamble. He says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion." Well, anybody reading that would say, "Onion? You meant union. You spelled it with an O." And so the next scribe who comes along is going to correct it based on what he knows the text says and what he knows is an obvious mistake. What this really illustrates is that every single one of us, every single day, is a textual critic. When you get an email from someone that's got grammatical glitches, you say, "Oh, this is what he meant." Sometimes the emails are so discombobulated you can't tell at all what the author meant. But for the most part, you could say, he meant to say this, and he didn't. He forgot this comma. He forgot this question mark. He didn't put in this apostrophe, or he left out the, or his, or something like that. But I understand what he's trying to say. We do this subconsciously every single day with any written document that we ever look at.
I mean, I even find this sometimes when I'm reading books that there are still typos and misprints in books. I'll say, well, I know what the author originally meant. It doesn't really matter to me too much.
Right. That's the point, is that these early scribes could make those corrections of the unintentional errors. And let me add one other thing, and that is Craig Evans is about to publish an article that makes a really significant point. He's a great New Testament Gospels and a Second Temple Judaism scholar who works in the Dead Sea Scrolls extensively. He
was also on the show on March 1st.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Well, Evans has been working in the longevity of these ancient papyrus texts, and he's read a very important document where the scholar pointed out that the average literary text would last 200 or 300 years. And so you're talking about a manuscript that would be read and read frequently and even at times copied, lasting for 200 or 300 years, written on papyrus. Now, if you apply that to the New Testament, what that means is the original documents, which would certainly be read and read very, very frequently, they could last as much as 200 or 300 years. I think they didn't last that long. I think they may have lasted 100, maybe even 150 years at the outside. But that's because they were read even more frequently than these classical texts were, and they were also copied. Now, here's the point. Let's just say you've got a manuscript that lasts for 50 years, say Paul's letter to the Romans, and it exists for 50 years before it turns to dust. Do you really think that book, which is so important, and the early church recognized how significant it is going to be copied just once? Of course not. people are going to copy it, recopy it, and copy it again for various churches throughout the Mediterranean world. And even Tertullian in the late 2nd or early 3rd century said that these original documents were still in those original churches. And he said, run over to the church of Ephesus or Colossae, and you could see these original documents. Now, I think Tertullian probably is not right. I think he tended to exaggerate and do a little propaganda, but it showed his interest in this, and it showed that there was at that time an interest of making sure to get the text right. And this is something that was not invented with Tertullian, but goes back earlier. So let's say a scribe comes along and he's doing reading a copy of a copy of a copy of Romans, but this is, say, the year 100, 120, something like that, and he happens to be close to Rome. He's copying out this text. He says, wait a minute, I don't understand what the scribe's trying to say. He made a mistake here, but I don't know what the original said. And so he copies this whole thing out. Then he has a visit to Rome. He goes to the church. He has Paul's letter to the Romans, the original document in front of him, and he fixes his copy based on that. That is not only not an implausible scenario, it is a very likely scenario repeated throughout for every single book of the New Testament many times over.
Now, there were some times, though, that some changes were made to the text, and these were intentional changes. So, I mean, there you have it. They're trying to butter up the text, remove all these huge problems and such. Just can't trust it, can you?
Well, it's interesting, the kinds of changes that were made to the text that were intentional, the vast majority of them were still very, very minor. You get them especially in the Synoptic Gospels, where here's what would happen. Say somebody is copying out the Gospel of Mark, and he's just copied the Gospel of Matthew. Now, if he's copied the Gospel of Matthew, and of course we have the order of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is found in most of our manuscripts, but not all. Some have a couple differences. But say he's just copied the Gospel of Matthew in a codex. So say this is the middle of the 2nd century, late 2nd century, and now he's copying out the Gospel of Mark. Well, he'd just seen Matthew, and 600 of Mark's 660 verses are virtually duplicated in Matthew. So he's having deja vu experience all over again, And he comes to a verse and he says, I just saw this in Matthew, and I know that the scribe whose text I'm copying made some mistakes. I bet he made a mistake here too, because they don't say the same thing. So he keeps correcting his copy of Mark to conform it to Matthew's gospel. Well, one of the things this tells us is that kind of activity happened largely after the codex form was invented and after all 4 Gospels could be put between 2 covers. And so that's coming a little bit later in the Christian church. But earlier, you're not going to have that kind of a thing happen. But it also shows us that these scribes were pious people who were trying to change it because they saw some kind of a discrepancy. But we have, nevertheless, a very strong strain of extremely accurate manuscripts that come from Alexandria. Alexandria was the epicenter for copying of ancient classical texts in the ancient world, and they had all sorts of rules of how to make accurate copies that were written down in the 2nd century BC. So our Alexandrian manuscripts, which most scholars would regard as by far the best ones we have for the New Testament, were copied carefully. They have very few harmonizations, like from one gospel to another. They may have some spelling mistakes and like that, but they're not given to these let's add a lot of material kinds of things as the manuscripts in other areas were.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking that when Peter Williams has been on Unbelievable before debating Bart Ehrman, he says, this is Bart Ehrman's problem. He always goes with scribal error instead of just an accidental mistake. I mean, he always goes with intelligent design instead of chance.
That's a good point.
Well, there's another point I'd like to make on that, but we're going to take a quick break and come back for our final session. I'm Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters podcast. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. We'll be back to wrap things up after this.
Check out CYIWorldwide.com. CYIWorldwide.com. Home of Grok Radio. Free music downloads, advice, prayer, and support. CYIWorldwide.com. Do you grok?
And I'm Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters podcast. My guest is Dr. Daniel Wallace. We're wrapping things Now, there's another way also that I tell people that intentional changes get made in the manuscript, and that's when someone was writing out a lectionary as well for public reading, and they come to a part of the text where it say something like, he went into Jerusalem, where the audience at home doesn't have Bibles where they can all pick up and read like we do today. So the scribe would just say, Jesus went to Jerusalem. And so we get that, and that shows up as a variant. Now, that happens quite often, too, doesn't it?
Yeah, the lectionaries would just have what's known as a pericope, or a self-contained story, typically from the Gospels, as the daily reading or the reading for that particular day. And in Mark's Gospel, for example, in chapters 6, 7, and 8, he has 89 verses in a row where Jesus is never mentioned by name or by title. It's just he. And it's kind of an impoverished writing style, and yet Mark makes the reader work sometimes a little bit too hard to understand what he's saying, but it's still what I would consider to be inspired scripture, but with very much of a human face to it. And so you get a lectionary that grows out of that, and you start in and saying Jesus, or he's going to Jerusalem. The lectionary is going to have to change that to Jesus. I have photographs of a lectionary we shot in Münster in John 13, and where it starts out by saying, he said to them, but the lectionary has, Jesus said to his disciples. And that's just kind of a standard change. Now, the lectionary system, the lectionaries were read over and over and over again. That's the second largest category of manuscripts we have for the New Testament is lectionaries. And right after the minuscules, we have about 2,400 lectionaries. The vast majority of them are just on the Gospels. But that lectionary system, that's what was read in the churches and even in the homes over and over and over again every year. So people get used to that form of it. And consequently, when the scribes came to copying out normal scripture, just continuous text, Mark 1:1 through 16:8, the whole thing, rather than just a certain passage and then moving on to another passage from another gospel, they would often incorporate the readings that they had from the lectionaries because that's what they remembered. In fact, it was so subconscious that I've come across, I believe now, 3 or 4 manuscripts that are what's called continuous text manuscripts. They have the whole book in it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that kind of thing, rather than just the readings like lectionaries do. Mm-hmm. And the title for the Gospels is, it's the From the Gospel of Matthew, or the From the Gospel of Mark, rather than the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, or the Gospel according to Mark. It's the From the Gospel. And that kind of a phrase comes directly out of lectionaries. So even when the scribe is being very, very careful to write out the text of his gospel, the very title he gives it betrays the fact that he has been a lectionary copyist for a long, long time, and he's not even used to writing regular manuscripts. So he's going to be importing all sorts of things from the lectionaries. The lectionary system goes back very old to the 3rd century. And consequently, it has a major impact on a lot of manuscripts, especially the Byzantine manuscripts, which are generally the ones that stand behind the King James Bible.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are so many areas that we can also go into further, but since we are wrapping things up, let's get into some basic summations here. First off, a lot of my listeners will be encountering critics, no doubt, all around the internet, everywhere else. What are some of the best resources they can go to in learning to defend the New Testament manuscripts and find out the methods and styles of textual criticism?
Well, I would, first of all, recommend that your listeners get a hold of Reinventing Jesus. This is a book that James Sawyer and Ed Komashevsky and I co-authored in 2006. And you can get it on Amazon. Reinventing Jesus is the title. It's got 5 sections that deal with these major issues about the New Testament where there's been critical attacks. So, for example, did the gospel writers get it right about the life of Jesus? Did the scribes get it right about the manuscripts? We have 5 chapters on that, which is the largest section in the book. Did the church get it right as to what books go into the New Testament and which books don't? And did the a church invent, or did Constantine invent the deity of Christ or the canon? Those kinds of silly notions. And then did Christianity borrow heavily from, or at all, from mystery religions? So those are the sections, and the section on textual criticism really lays out all the evidence for people. I think it's helpful. It's meant for lay readers, and that's a significant text to get. After that, there's a number of other books, but I would also recommend Craig Blomberg's recent book, Can We Still Believe the Bible? That's an excellent work. Mm-hmm. It's up to date, and your readers are going to like that a lot, I think.
And if they do like that one, they should be listening next week, because that is who's going to be on, and that is the book we're going to be talking about. And when it comes to reinventing Jesus, I can say that I checked that one out from our college library, and it is one of the best books I have read on defending historical Christianity, because it covers so much out there, and I've just thoroughly impressed by it. And so if anyone wants to read Reinventing Jesus, I've just checked on Amazon. You can get it on the Kindle for $9.99, and you can get the paperback version for $13.82. It's Reinventing Jesus by Komaszewski, Daniel Wallace, and by James Sawyer. So yeah, I definitely recommend that one.
Well, thank you. I happen to agree that it really accomplishes a lot. We're pleased that it has been published.
Mm-hmm. Now, if a Christian comes to you now and says, you've said so much about copying and all this going on, if I'm going into my church, do I need to worry that I've got the Word of God in my hands or not?
I would have to say that regardless of the translation, the translation, there's really two issues. What is the text they're translating, and how are they translating? Is it paraphrastic? Is it more literal? And even along those lines, is there a bias that goes in some directions? But as far as the textual basis is concerned, I'd have to say that even though there are some differences between, say, the King James Bible and any modern translation, none of those affects a cardinal doctrine. And we want to be as faithful and as accurate as we can be, but every single one of us, when we hold up our Bible, we can say, in all essential respects, this is in fact the Word of God. Mm-hmm. I think with modern translations, it comes even closer, so that even a guy like Bart Ehrman and I would have disagreements over only about 50 places, just a few dozen places, would we disagree on what the original wording is, out of the 1,000 variants that are meaningful and viable. That's huge. And that's where most textual critics are, is in that range of just a few dozen differences between the two groups. So in all essential respects, and in the vast majority of particulars, yes, you can be confident that what you have in your hands is the Word of God. I think it's important, too, though, to have a Bible that will list the marginal readings, the variants that are found that are more important. For example, you'll see some ancient authorities have this or don't have these 12 verses or something. And that gives you a sense of really what's at stake. And the Bible I would recommend the most that does that would be the Net Bible, which has, I was the senior New Testament editor for it. Mm-hmm. It has more footnotes than any other Bible in history, over 60,000 footnotes. And we have hundreds of notes on textual criticism. It simply says TC and then it discusses it. We discuss the major problems in the New Testament text and talk about whether this reading is right or that reading is right, what's affected. Sometimes we might have a full page of a footnote discussing it. So for those who really want to get in the details, the Net Bible is a great way to go.
And if anyone wants to get the Net Bible, it all depends on what car you're getting. You can get a Kindle version of it for $5 as notes. Everything else ranges to about $30 to $55 or so. But you can get a free version of the Net Bible, but without notes. I'm guessing you'd be missing a whole lot with that.
Yeah, and I think you can download the whole thing for free if you want to. It's download and print it kind of thing. So
yeah, I'm definitely going to. Yeah, probably one of the first things I'm going to be doing off this podcast is rushing for my Kindle and seeing if I can get that.
Yeah, that's great.
Now, one thing, in fact, you've even said, we're talking about how the manuscripts are, is that for work like you do with the New Testament manuscripts, it can at times be exceptionally, I'm surprised to say it, boring, right?
Yeah, it's not that way at all. It's a very exciting field to work in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought it was because all the manuscripts were so incredibly similar that you just end up looking at the same thing over and over.
Yeah, and the very fact that they differ, every manuscript differs from every other manuscript, at least in a few ways, and some in pretty significant ways. But this very fact has brought a great deal of piety to scholarship. When Samuel Tregelles went to the Vatican to look at Codex Vaticanus, a 4th century manuscript that has almost the whole New Testament still in it, the monks there were flipping the pages. He was not allowed to take any notes with him. He could study the manuscript for 6 hours a day, which is still true at the Vatican. When I looked at Vaticanus a few years back, the same kind of rules. And so they would, if it looked like he was starting to memorize the text, they would flip the page, and so he had to get off that. He couldn't take any notes. He goes back to his cell at night, and he writes down all the textual variants in Codex Vaticanus that he had seen in those 6 hours, and the ones he could remember, which was a great deal of them. That's incredible that somebody could be so pious. There are New Testament scholars who have memorized the entire Greek New Testament and can simply discuss all sorts of data with you because they know it well, and they know these variants as well, which is, I think if the church had the original manuscripts and we didn't have to do textual criticism, I suspect our interest in the Bible would significantly be diminished. These manuscripts would end up in some monasteries in Europe where they would be locked away in a case, and then it gets venerated but not touched, But when you are working in textual criticism, you're actually doing kind of Sherlock Holmes work. You're trying to figure out who's the cause, what reading is the source of the other readings, and you've got to do this with looking at the manuscripts and the versions and the fathers, and with the internal evidence to see if this fits the author's style and would a scribe be likely to change it, those kinds of things. It's very exciting, very interesting work.
In fact, before you come out with, if we had the original, they were locked away and such. And when we were talking about the idea of Constantine could just order the Bible to be changed to say what he wanted it to say and such, but if you have the originals locked away, you didn't have this plethora of manuscripts, that could have very well been the case, because you'd just be stuck with some one person before you who can come out and say, this is what the Bible says, and I know because I've got the original hidden back here. But because of textual manuscript, no one person can really control the text, can they?
That's correct. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we have in Ethiopia allegedly the Ark of the Covenant in a church there. And they say, well, you can't look at it, you're just going to have to trust us that that's what we have. And you go, well, that's non-verifiable. If it's non-verifiable, I can't trust that at all. That's what the situation might have been like for the New Testament if we had all the original manuscripts. I mean, that would be kind of scary.
And I'm guessing we haven't sent Indiana Jones over yet, have we?
Not yet.
Okay. So now, kind of, we went full circle, and you have this Aryan guy who was asking all these questions and was putting your faith in jeopardy, because if we're now here we are several years later, after 25 years at least of studying these kinds of manuscripts and such, where is your faith in the claims of Christ today?
My faith is deeper and stronger than it's ever been. And at the same time, on the one hand, I'd say, I think when I was a younger Christian, I had some fears. Is this really true?
Yep.
But I had to work through those fears and say, I will pursue this because I've got to know the truth. In fact, that's what really brought me to that radical commitment to Christ. Is I said, I'm not going to just take the faith of my parents. I've got to know for myself if this is really what the truth is. And so I think my faith has deepened. It's become stronger, and it's also become more nuanced. I think I may well have started out kind of on the rigid side about a lot of views. Grew up in a fundamentalist church, but I've moved, I think, significantly away from that. And so there's not only more nuance to my faith, but as my uncle puts it, I believe in less and less, but what I believe in, I believe more and more in. So, and what I mean by that is that Christ has become so much more precious to me now than he was when I was a young man. And the Bible, as important as it is, and obviously if I have the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, I think it's extraordinarily important, is not the same as the person of Jesus Christ. And so I've got my priorities, I think, in the right way, and I'm not afraid to ask the tough questions. I'm excited about asking those questions.
As one who's been doing apologetics ministry for nearly 15 years now, I have to agree with you wholeheartedly on that kind of thing. But we're getting to the point of wrapping things up here. If someone wants to find out more about you and your work, where do they go?
Well, there's a couple places they could go. One would be csntm.org. That would be one place where we talk about what we're doing with the manuscripts. And another place would be my blog. I have a blog site called Daniel B. as in boy, Wallace.com. And I put up essays maybe one or two a month. It's not real frequent, but I'm trying to deal with some recent issues and critical things. And so that's where I did the review of Craig Blomberg's book, and I just did another one on a book that is talking about the New Standard Critical Greek New Testament. But I do things for lay people as well. And so we're going to be starting a series here soon on that site that I've asked my pastor to contribute to on abortion. And so there's a lot of issues that we cover, but it's just kind of whatever I want to deal with or whatever's the hot topic for the moment. But people can get to know me a little bit there, and they can also get to know me at CSNTM.
Well, we got a little over 3 minutes left. What's the final message you'd like to leave with the Deeper Waters audience?
I think it's important, first, for you not to be afraid to pursue the truth, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian. And at the same time, in your pursuit of truth, to say, I really, really want to be open to all the evidence. To my liberal friends and agnostic friends, I would say, I think you're playing games with yourself if you think that you are being open to all the evidence. The old idea of what it was to be a liberal was to be somebody who would be open to the evidence and examine it and sift through it. Now a liberal simply means somebody who is closed to supernaturalism. I'm not talking about a political liberal, but a theological liberal that holds to a naturalist worldview. Well, that's not very liberal in my mind. That's very conservative. And so I would urge you to really be open to the evidence and ask yourself the question, if there really is a God, and if he really does interact with human affairs, then is the resurrection of Jesus a likely, viable, plausible option? Is it likely or plausible or even possible that the manuscripts of the New Testament we have today do, in all essential respects, go back to the original, and that original text is telling the truth about Jesus? Those would be some of the things that I would stress for your listeners. I guess I'd also say this. I think in this age, to the Christians now I want to appeal, in this era, it's easy to find anything you want to on the Internet. But the problem is that it's not refereed and you don't know who the responsible people are. It's important more now than ever before for us to be good readers and to read books that are published by reputable publishing houses, by scholars who know what they're talking about, and see what they have to say, because without any kind of referees on the Internet, we have no anchor whatsoever as to what is truth and what is not.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone that next week Craig Blomberg will be my guest about Can We Still Believe the Bible? But I'd like to thank Dr. Daniel Wallace for giving us an excellent show. I've been getting some comments and emails about how good it's going. And I hope we'll see you back here again sometime.
I'd love to be back on again, Nick. Thanks.
Well, when you get a book coming out again or something, you let me know. We'll get you right on here. Now,
okay, well, I hope you and yours have a happy Easter tomorrow.
I hope you have a happy Easter, too. Now, I'm Nick Peters, signing off until next time.